Hollywood remembers Chinatown as a masterpiece. It remembers Faye Dunaway with a verdict. During the film's production, conflict between Dunaway and Roman Polanski became part of Hollywood legend. But the story that survived was shaped by an old imbalance. His severity could be absorbed into the mythology of the demanding auteur, while her resistance hardened into evidence that she was difficult. The film entered the canon. The label followed the actress. Whether or not every detail of the set can now be settled, the reputation outlived the incident. How did one of cinema's most celebrated productions leave its director protected by prestige and its leading woman trapped inside a single word? Chinatown arrived as the kind of film that makes its own production history seem secondary. The finished work is controlled, elegant, and almost unnervingly precise. Los Angeles appears sunlit and corrupt at the same time. Every room seems to conceal another agreement. Every polite exchange carries pressure underneath it. The screenplay turns private damage into civic rot, and Roman Polanski's direction gives that rot a clean visual surface. The film does not look improvised or unstable. It looks inevitable. At the center of that design is Faye Dunaway as Evelyn Mulwray. Her performance does not depend on volume. It depends on restraint. Evelyn speaks carefully because the truth around her is dangerous. She holds herself together because collapse would give other people more power over her. Dunaway makes that tension visible without explaining it. A pause, a guarded look, a sentence delivered too evenly. Each choice tells the audience that Evelyn is protecting more than information. She is protecting the remaining shape of herself. That work earned Dunaway an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. The film itself became one of the defining achievements of 1970s American cinema and was later selected for preservation in the National Film Registry. Its screenplay, performances, photography, and direction entered the language of prestige. Chinatown became the kind of title critics use to measure other films. Its authority grew cleaner with time. Canon formation is selective. A film is preserved through restored prints, anniversary screenings, critical essays, film school syllabi, and lists of essential works. Those forms of remembrance are built to protect the object. They ask what the film achieved, how the images work, and why the structure endures. They are less equipped to preserve the full emotional and professional conditions of the people who made it. The result is not necessarily a lie, it is a hierarchy. The work receives context, argument, and renewed attention. The performer often receives a story. For Dunaway, the story increasingly arrived in a single form. She had helped create Evelyn's mystery, intelligence, and fear, yet the language around the actress drifted toward temperament. The more the film was discussed as a triumph of control, the more the actress became vulnerable to being discussed as resistance to that control. One reputation expanded through craft, the other narrowed through anecdote. That imbalance matters because Chinatown depends on Dunaway being more than an image. Evelyn is the point where the film's corruption becomes personal. Without her guarded performance, the mystery remains clever but remote. Dunaway gives the film its human cost. The canon preserved that effect. It was less careful about preserving the performer's authority in creating it. That is the first contradiction. The work became easier to praise as the human friction behind it became easier to reduce. Public memory preserved the final cut, not the full balance of power that produced it. Polanski's control became part of the film's legend. Dunaway's resistance became part of hers. This does not mean the production can be reduced to a simple story of a cruel director and a powerless actress. Dunaway was not powerless. She was already a major star when she entered the film. Bonnie and Clyde had made her one of the defining faces of New Hollywood. She had prestige, leverage, and a previous Academy Award nomination. She understood the camera, understood her value, and had developed strong ideas about how a performance should be built. But star power and production power are not the same thing. A performer may have billing, salary, and the authority to argue for a character. The director still controls the frame, the pace of the day, the number of takes, and the version of the performance that reaches the audience. Polanski did not work as though the set were a loose collective. Accounts of his method describe a director who gave actors highly specific instructions and expected them to fit the visual and emotional design he had already formed. That method helped create the precision people still admire. It also created a difficult working structure for an actress who did not see herself as material to be placed. Dunaway approached Evelyn from the inside. She wanted psychological continuity, protection for the character's dignity, and enough control to keep the performance from becoming decorative. Polanski approached the film from the completed image. He was responsible for what the camera captured, and he exercised that responsibility with an authority the industry was inclined to respect. The conflict was not simply personality against personality, it was authority against authorship. Dunaway had authorship over what she brought to Evelyn. Polanski had final authority over how that work was used. The tension became memorable because both believed the performance mattered, but only one of them controlled the machinery that would define it. Hollywood has always had a language for this kind of power. When a male director is exacting, the industry often calls him disciplined, obsessive, uncompromising, or visionary. Those words turn severity into method. They suggest that discomfort may be the price of precision. When a female performer protects her process with equal force, the vocabulary often changes. She becomes temperamental, demanding, unstable, or difficult. The behavior does not have to be identical for the double standard to operate. What changes is the presumption. His intensity begins as evidence of purpose. Hers begins as a problem requiring explanation. Chinatown benefited from that old vocabulary. The more revered the film became, the easier it was to read Polanski's control backward from the result. The finished image worked, so the method acquired protection. This is how prestige can clean a production history without falsifying it. The conflict remains known, but the success of the film teaches the public how to distribute meaning. The director's severity becomes part of the achievement. The actress's resistance becomes part of her reputation. Dunaway could defend herself during a scene. She could object, argue, leave, return, or insist on another approach. What she could not control was the story that would form afterward. That story would be shaped by memoirs, interviews, crew recollections, entertainment profiles, jokes, repeated anecdotes, and later accounts written by people who had not been in the room. The set ended. The interpretation continued. The mythology of the auteur made that interpretation easier. By the 1970s, American film culture had become deeply invested in the director as the central author of a movie. That idea gave critics a powerful way to discuss style and consistency. It also concentrated moral and creative credit. When the film succeeded, the director's personality could become part of the explanation. Obsession, severity, and control were no longer merely workplace traits. They became evidence of authorship. The actress occupied a less protected position. Her performance could be praised, but the story of how she worked remained easier to separate from the art and attach to her character. A director's difficult method could belong to a masterpiece. An actress's difficult method could follow her to the next job. One was framed as a process, the other became a reputation. Dunaway's position was especially exposed because she was neither compliant nor easy to dismiss. A lesser-known performer might have been replaced or silenced. A major star could resist, but resistance created witnesses, stories, and institutional memory. Her power allowed her to fight in the moment. It did not guarantee that the fight would later be described in her terms. This is why the power map must include more than the director and the actress. It includes the press that selected the anecdotes, the executives who heard them, the colleagues who repeated them, and the audience that learned to recognize the label. No single participant needed to design the final verdict. The structure could produce it through repetition. That is where this case moves beyond one film. A production conflict is temporary. A reputation file can keep collecting evidence for decades. Once a label is attached, later stories are no longer heard neutrally. They are fitted into the existing frame. A strong opinion becomes confirmation. A bad day becomes pattern. A performance that frightens the audience begins to look like evidence about the performer herself. The first crack in the clean public image of Chinatown did not come from a lawsuit or a formal complaint. It came from the kind of small physical incident Hollywood loves, because it can be retold quickly. The details have been repeated in discussions of the production and revisited in coverage surrounding the documentary Faye. A strand of Dunaway's hair was interfering with a shot. Assistant director Hawk Koch later described efforts to control it with hairspray. The problem continued. Polanski then pulled the hair from her head. The action was brief. Its meaning was not. A strand of hair is almost nothing in the scale of a production. It can delay a close-up, catch light, disrupt continuity, or draw the director's eye. From Polanski's position, it was a visual problem inside a frame he was responsible for controlling. From Dunaway's position, the correction crossed from direction into her body. What one person may have viewed as an impatient solution, the other experienced as a boundary being ignored. Dunaway reacted angrily and left the set. Later retellings say she returned wearing a hat, allowing the production to continue without the hair becoming the same point of conflict. The incident did not end the film. It did not explain every tension that followed. It did not single-handedly create her reputation, but it offered Hollywood memory exactly what it prefers: a compact scene with a visible action, a clear reaction, and two famous people whose authority could be judged differently. The hair mattered because it condensed the larger imbalance. Polanski's concern belonged to the image, Dunaway's concern belonged to the boundary between the image and the person creating it. The production needed both the close-up and the actress, yet the retelling made it easier to remember the interruption than the work she was protecting. This is the point where public memory often becomes unfair without becoming entirely false. Dunaway did react strongly. The conflict was real. The mistake is not acknowledging that reaction. The mistake is treating it as a complete explanation of character while leaving the power around it uninterrogated. A person can be difficult in a moment. A working environment can also make certain reactions more likely. Both can be true, and history often preserves only the version that is easiest to repeat. Small incidents survive because they appear to explain larger conflicts. They offer a scene the public can picture and repeat. A disagreement about performance theory is difficult to summarize. A director pulling a hair and an actress walking away can be told in seconds. The anecdote becomes a container for everything people already believe about both figures. For Polanski, the story could support the image of extreme visual control. He noticed what others would ignore and corrected what interrupted the frame. For Dunaway, the same story could support the image of volatility. She reacted left and returned on terms that made the rupture visible. The anecdote did not have to choose one meaning, but public memory rarely gives equal weight to both. What mattered was not only the action, it was the direction in which interpretation flowed. The director's impatience pointed back toward the shot. The actress's anger pointed forward toward her personality. His behavior remained attached to the work. Hers became portable. Jack Nicholson later used a joking nickname for Dunaway, Dread, or the dreaded Dunaway. By Dunaway's own account, she liked it. That detail matters because it prevents the story from becoming too clean. The nickname did not begin as a sentence imposed on a helpless woman. It could function as wit, recognition, even pride. It acknowledged that she was formidable and not easily managed. But a nickname can change when it leaves the relationship that gave it context. Inside a working friendship, dread could be affectionate. Inside the wider culture, it fit too easily beside a story already forming about Dunaway's temperament. The words carried rhythm. They were memorable. They required no explanation. That made them useful. Hollywood reputation is often built through useful language. The industry does not need a formal decision to turn a person into a type. It needs repetition. One story appears in an interview, another turns up in a memoir. A later profile uses the old adjective because readers already recognize it. A director's complaint, a co-star's joke, an awards season anecdote, and a difficult production from another decade begin to sit beside one another. The file grows without anyone having to declare that a file exists. The process is not neutral. The label starts organizing the evidence. Once Dunaway was widely read as difficult, later conflicts could be interpreted as confirmation before their details were understood. That does not mean every account was invented or unfair. Dunaway herself has acknowledged perfectionism, outbursts, and behavior she would later view differently. The documentary Faye does not present her as a faultless victim. It is more useful than that. It asks why her mistakes became so central to the way her work was remembered, while the harsh authority of men around her remained easier to separate from their art. That distinction is the real subject of this case, Accountability is not the same as reduction. Dunaway can be held responsible for her conduct without allowing one adjective to replace the full record. She can be demanding, brilliant, difficult, disciplined, vulnerable, controlling, wounded, and self-aware at different moments. The problem begins when a culture decides complexity is unnecessary because one word is more efficient. The label became more durable because it could absorb later work. In 1981, Dunaway played Joan Crawford in Mommy Dearest. The performance was large, theatrical, and polarizing. The film's reputation changed over time, but its most extreme images entered popular culture almost immediately. Dunaway's face in that role became inseparable from rage, control, and spectacle. Public memory does not always maintain a clean boundary between performance and personality. After Mommy Dearest, the distance between Dunaway and the woman she played became harder to preserve. The role did not create her reputation, but it gave that reputation powerful imagery. Viewers who had heard she was difficult could now attach the label to a performance built around frightening authority. The work became evidence, even though acting is not confession. The reception of Mommy Dearest shows how public memory can turn performance into a shortcut. The film itself became a contested cultural object, criticized, quoted, mocked, and later embraced in ways that changed over time. Dunaway's performance remained at the center of that argument. Some viewers saw fearless commitment, others saw excess. The role became impossible to discuss without discussing Dunaway herself. That fusion carried a cost. When a male actor plays rage, obsession, or cruelty at an extreme level, the performance can enlarge his range. The audience is encouraged to admire the transformation. With Dunaway, the transformation often seemed to confirm the reputation already waiting for her. The work did not simply expand her image, it closed the circle around it. Again, this does not mean criticism of the performance was illegitimate. Mommy Dearest was divisive, and Dunaway later expressed regret about the project. The point is how quickly one performance became part of a broader moral reading of the actress. The distinction between she made a choice that did not work and this is who she is became increasingly thin. Once that boundary weakened, later retrospectives could discuss the role, the old nickname, the Chinatown conflict, and other stories as though they were chapters in one consistent personality. The timeline produced coherence. Coherence produced certainty. The label looked proven because the culture had arranged the evidence to make it so. This is one of the more punishing mechanisms in celebrity culture. A performer is praised for disappearing into a role, then judged as though the role revealed what had been there all along. The stronger the performance, the easier the confusion becomes. Dunaway's capacity to project control, anger, and fear was part of her talent. Yet those same qualities could be pulled out of the fictional frame and attached to the public woman. The result was not a single campaign designed in one room. It was more ordinary and therefore harder to challenge. Reviews, gossip, profiles, interviews, later disputes, and audience memory reinforced one another. The label saved time. It made complicated stories easier to summarize. It also made it harder for any new story to arrive without being interpreted through the old one. A reputation like this becomes self-confirming. If Dunaway asked for more preparation, the request could be heard as evidence of control. If she challenged a director, the disagreement could be read as proof of temperament. If she remained silent, the silence might be taken as hauteur. The frame did not need to make every judgment false. It only needed to make one interpretation feel natural before the facts were known. That is why the incident on Chinatown mattered less than the language it helped feed. The pulled hair did not explain Dunaway's career. It did not account for every later conflict or every criticism. But it became symbolic because the reputation system needed symbols. It offered a scene in which Polanski's control could be understood as dedication to the image, while Dunaway's reaction could be remembered as an eruption. The difference in language is visible throughout Hollywood history. Directors who demand repeated takes, challenge actors, reject compromise, or create tense sets are often protected by the scale of the work. Their behavior can be criticized, but the criticism remains separate from authorship. The film still belongs to their vision. The difficulty becomes one chapter in the mythology of achievement. Actresses rarely receive the same division. Their temperament is treated as part of the performance, part of the casting decision, and part of the explanation for what happened to their careers. The label moves across categories. It becomes personal, professional, and historical at once. With Dunaway, this difference became especially powerful because she did not fit the image of effortless femininity Hollywood preferred to sell. Her screen presence was sharp, intelligent, and controlled. She could appear fragile without becoming passive. She could appear glamorous without making glamour comforting. Her characters often carried information the men around them wanted to possess. She made withholding look like action. That quality made her indispensable to Chinatown. Evelyn Mulwray is surrounded by men who investigate her, question her, interpret her, and decide what her silence means. She is treated as a problem before the full structure of her situation is understood. The film's tragedy depends on the audience learning that the woman who seemed evasive was protecting a truth more dangerous than the men judging her had imagined. The parallel to Dunaway's reputation should not be pushed into a perfect metaphor. A character is not an actress, and a film plot does not prove what happened on a set. But the comparison remains difficult to ignore. The performance at the center of Chinatown asks the audience to reconsider a woman after the first judgment proves inadequate. Hollywood memory was less patient with the actress who created her. That irony became one reason the documentary Faye mattered when it appeared in 2024. The film did not reveal that Dunaway had secretly been misunderstood in every dispute. It did not erase testimony about her behavior or offer an uncomplicated defense. Instead, it reopened the conditions under which the public had learned to read her. Dunaway appears in later life speaking directly about the work, the ambition, the damage, and the reputation. She acknowledges perfectionism and past outbursts. She discusses personal struggles that shaped her behavior. She does not ask the audience to pretend that every old account was unfair. What she asks for implicitly and sometimes directly is proportion. Proportion changes the case. Without it, the argument becomes another attempt to reverse the label. Difficult becomes misunderstood, and one simplistic verdict replaces another. With proportion, a harder picture emerges. Dunaway could behave badly, make mistakes, and create strain. She could also be subjected to a vocabulary that made her conduct more defining than the comparable severity surrounding celebrated male authority. The documentary also revisited her relationship with Polanski in a way that resisted easy revenge. Dunaway could describe the work as difficult and still recognize his ability as a director. That combination matters. It returns agency to her. She was not simply acted upon. She participated in the creation of a major film, fought over the process, and understood the value of the result. This is where the public trial becomes more mature. The question is not whether Dunaway was always right. The record does not support that. The question is whether Hollywood used the truth of some conflicts to build a larger verdict that became harder to escape than the incidents themselves. The word difficult is powerful because it sounds modest. It does not appear to accuse someone of a crime. It presents itself as professional judgment. That makes it unusually durable. A studio can repeat it without producing a file. A journalist can use it without proving a pattern. An audience can inherit it without knowing where it began. For male artists, difficulty can remain attached to the work. The director was difficult because the film was difficult to make. The severity becomes part of the method. For women, the same word often detaches from the work and settles on the person. She was difficult, full stop. The sentence no longer requires a project, a conflict, or another participant. Polanski's authority benefited from this distinction. His demanding method could be narrated through the success of Chinatown. Jack Nicholson reportedly explained his willingness to submit to exact direction by calling Polanski a genius. The word did not erase tension. It organized it. If the director was a genius, then severity could be placed inside the logic of creation. Dunaway had no equivalent word with the same protective force. Star did not protect her. Oscar nominee did not protect her. Later, Oscar winner did not protect her. Her discipline could earn awards, while her temperament remained available for punishment. Hollywood could value the result and distrust the person who produced it. That is why the familiar argument about whether she was really difficult misses the structure. The answer may be yes in some situations. Dunaway herself has acknowledged enough to make denial dishonest. But the more revealing question is why the industry needed the answer to become total. Why did a pattern of conflict become the preferred lens for reading decades of work? Why did her reputation require so little separation between one set and the next? The public did not receive a neutral archive. It received a method of interpretation. That method told viewers to approach Dunaway with caution. It taught them to read tension in her face as evidence, intensity in her performances as leakage, and stories of conflict as confirmation. Even praise could be filtered through the same frame. She was brilliant but difficult, powerful but frightening, great but costly. The word "but" did much of the damage. It placed achievement and character in permanent opposition. Her artistry could be admired only after the warning had been repeated. The warning became part of the price of entry. Yet Chinatown itself was allowed to become simpler with time. The film could be praised for its fatalism, structure, performance, and control without requiring every discussion to reopen the ethics of its production. The work was granted independence from the set. Dunaway was not granted the same independence from the stories told about her there. This is what it means for the work to survive cleaner than the person did. The film entered the canon as an object. Its contradictions could be studied, but they did not contaminate its basic prestige. Dunaway entered memory as a person already annotated. Her performances arrived with footnotes about temperament. The damage was not immediate career destruction. The record clearly contradicts that claim. Dunaway remained a major actress after Chinatown. Her performance was honored with an Academy Award nomination, and 2 years later she won Best Actress for Network. She continued working, receiving acclaim, controversy, and opportunity in different measures. The damage was interpretive. A label began arriving before she did. The ledger begins with authorship. Dunaway did not lose credit for playing Evelyn Mulray, but the language around her reduced how much artistic intention the public was willing to grant her. A difficult actress appears to obstruct a director's vision. A serious collaborator helps create it. The label quietly moved her from the second category toward the first, even when the performance itself proved how essential her choices were. The second cost was credibility. Once a reputation precedes a person, explanation begins to sound like excuse. A future disagreement can be judged before the details arrive. An account from the actress may be weighed against years of folklore, even when the folklore was built from stories with different levels of verification. The person becomes responsible not only for the incident at hand, but for the accumulated expectation surrounding her name. The third cost was complexity. Dunaway's career contained ambition, discipline, vanity, courage, error, vulnerability, and extraordinary control of the camera. The label did not erase those qualities, but it placed them in a hierarchy. Difficulty became the headline. Everything else became supporting material. The fourth cost was historical clarity. When a reputation file becomes too strong, later viewers lose sight of which claims are documented and which are interpretation. Some stories are repeated so often that repetition itself begins to feel like proof. The label remains stable while the evidence underneath it varies. None of these costs can be converted into a simple claim that one movie destroyed a career. They are quieter. They shape the terms on which a career is discussed. They decide whether a performance is approached first as art or as evidence about the artist. That kind of cost is difficult to calculate because it does not leave one contract, one dismissal, or one public ruling. It shapes the atmosphere around future decisions. It affects how an argument is heard, how a mistake is remembered, how a director describes a collaboration, and how a journalist frames a profile. It can influence casting without leaving a document that says the label was the reason. The danger is claiming more than the evidence proves. It would be irresponsible to say the Chinatown conflict caused every later problem in Dunaway's career. It did not. Her reputation drew from multiple productions, accounts, and choices over many years. Some criticism came from people who believed they had legitimate reasons. Some stories remain disputed. Some details cannot now be settled. But uncertainty does not make the label harmless. In fact, uncertainty can strengthen it. A vague reputation travels easily because it does not depend on one verifiable event. People repeat the conclusion while forgetting the evidence. The word survives even when the original file is incomplete. The documentary Faye interrupted that process by placing Dunaway back inside her own record. It did not give her final control over history, but it changed the balance of voices. She could explain how she understood her ambition, her mistakes, her mental health, her relationships, and the cost of being reduced to temperament. That intervention matters because Hollywood memory often treats retrospection as a privilege. Male auteurs are often placed inside retrospectives that explain difficult behavior through artistic development. Women are more often asked to account for temperament. They are asked whether they regret being demanding, whether they were misunderstood, whether they accept the label. Faye partly accepts the evidence and rejects the total sentence. That is its most useful move. Dunaway does not need a clean slate. A clean slate would be another distortion. She needs a fuller record in which accountability does not erase context, and context does not erase accountability. The timing of the documentary also mattered. It arrived after decades in which the story had been told mostly through accumulated memory. By 2024, Dunaway's name carried both acclaim and warning. The documentary could not return the audience to a neutral starting point. It could only show how far the interpretation had already traveled. That made the film less a correction than a reopening. Old anecdotes were placed beside Dunaway's present voice. Praise was placed beside regret. The famous roles were placed beside the private effort required to sustain them. The result did not ask viewers to discard everything they had heard. It asked them to notice the architecture of what they had heard. A fairer record does not require every accusation to disappear. It requires distinctions. Which conflict is documented? Which account came later? Which behavior did Dunaway acknowledge? Which conclusion was supplied by repetition rather than proof? Once those questions enter the story, the label loses some of its authority. It becomes one interpretation among others rather than the key that opens every door. The distinction also protects the film from becoming a weapon against itself. Chinatown remains a major work. Dunaway's performance remains central to its power. Polanski's control remains part of how the film achieved its exact form. None of that requires the production history to be sanitized. Greatness does not become false when its methods are questioned. It becomes more accurately described. That is the moral tension at the center of reputation wars. Prestige often survives by separating the admired result from the person who absorbed the pressure. The public is encouraged to see the work as complete and the human conflict as incidental. But the conflict may reveal what the completed image was able to hide. In Chinatown, Dunaway's face carries the film's most guarded truth. Evelyn is misread because the men around her believe their authority gives them the right interpretation. The audience eventually learns how incomplete that interpretation was. Outside the film, Dunaway spent years inside another reading, imposed by people who believed the label already explained her. The comparison does not prove innocence. It proves the danger of certainty. Whether or not every old story can be resolved, the label outlived the incident. It outlived the production schedule, the magazine profiles that repeated it, and the cultural moment that made it useful. It survived because difficult allowed Hollywood to hold two ideas at once without examining the contradiction. Dunaway could be essential to the art and still be treated as the problem around it. That convenience benefited more than one person. It protected the prestige of the director by keeping conflict inside the actress's personality. It protected the industry by turning a power imbalance into a temperament story. It protected public nostalgia by allowing Chinatown to remain a clean masterpiece while the untidy cost was carried elsewhere. The result is not a verdict that Polanski was always wrong and Dunaway always right. That would repeat the same flattening in reverse. The more accurate verdict is that Hollywood had a language that turned his severity into authorship and hers into character. The difference mattered because language became memory. Memory became expectation. Expectation became a frame through which later behavior was judged. Dunaway's Oscar for Network did not erase that frame. Neither did the range of her work, from Bonnie and Clyde to Chinatown Network and the many roles that followed. Achievement can coexist with reputational damage. In fact, prestige can make the contradiction easier to ignore. The industry points to the award as proof that talent was recognized, while leaving unanswered how the person was discussed between victories. The public inherited the award and the adjective. The adjective often proved easier to repeat. That is the bitter legacy of this case. Chinatown remained prestigious because the culture knew how to preserve it as art. Polanski's directorial authority remained legible through the language of control, precision, and genius. Dunaway's performance remained admired, but the woman who gave it was repeatedly introduced through a warning. Half a century later, Faye did not remove the warning. It questioned who had written it, how often it had been repeated, and why it had been allowed to stand in for the whole person. The documentary reopened not only old stories, but the machinery that turned stories into identity. Hollywood remembers Chinatown as a masterpiece. It remembers Faye Dunaway with a label. The film deserved its place in the canon. Dunaway deserved more than an acquittal or another conviction. She deserved proportion. In Hollywood, itimnori difficult is rarely only a description. It can become a professional shorthand, a public filter, and a punishment that survives long after the incident that gave it force. The masterpiece stayed prestigious. The woman inside it stayed annotated. And the label survived because it remained useful to the people and institutions that preferred the conflict to belong to her. The final question is why that word became easier to preserve than the fuller record, the work, the power around it, and the woman who helped make the masterpiece all became secondary. If this case changed the way you read that label, share your view below, like the video, and subscribe to Reputation Wars.